op-ed. Well, she's not writing a thesis, so she's got to cut it down. She's got to simplify things. And so then you can start debating, well, are people simplifying things the right way? Are they doing little rhetorical tricks? And that's sort of, well, I don't know how you present it, but that's the thing, is that you got to go in and say, look, you're objecting not really to the theory. You're objecting to a popularization of the theory by one person. If you don't like the way they've written it, take it up with them. I mean, it's not like if Krugman writes something dubious in one of his op-eds, does that mean neoclassical macro is wrong? That no, no one, like, that's sort of a standard that MMT is held to, but not any other school of thought.
Welcome to Activist MMT, a podcast about real-world economics, including modern money theory, and how life changes when you discover it. I'm your host, Jeff Epstein. Today's part 3 of my 3-part conversation with author, financial analyst, and applied mathematician Brian Romanchuk. In part 1, we talked about his journey to MMT and his 2021 book, Modern Monetary Theory and the Recovery. In part 2, and today in part 3, we talk about the various techniques used by bad faith critics of MMT. More broadly, these are some of the things simple bullies do when they would prefer their followers to think they're not bullies. This interview was inspired by Chapter 5 of Brian's book, his recent appearance on MMT Podcast, and my own post of several good faith critiques. Links to all these things can be found in the show notes. This interview inspired me to write a new post summarizing the techniques Brian and I discussed today, plus my own definition of a good faith critique. You can find a link to this post in the show notes, and you can go directly to it at activistmmt.org/BFC-techniques. BFC for bad faith critic. That's activist.org/BFC-techniques. These techniques are not exclusive to MMT, of course, but Brian and I share several anecdotes and link them to actual critiques and critics. And now let's get right back to my conversation with Brian Romanchuk. Enjoy.
How are they presented? But the problem is like, I can see, there's issues, because once you start writing like a popularization, let's say Stephanie Kelton writes an op-ed. Well, she's not writing a thesis, so she's got to cut it down. She's got to simplify things. And so then you can start debating, well, are people simplifying things the right way? Are they doing little rhetorical tricks? And that's sort of, well, I don't know how you present it, but that's the thing, is that you got to go in and say, look, you're objecting not really to the theory. You're objecting to a popularization of the theory by one person. If you don't like the way they've written it, take it up with them. I mean, it's not like if Krugman writes something dubious in one of his op-eds, does that mean neoclassical macro is wrong? No one, like, that's sort of a standard that MMT is held to, but not any other school of thought. Like you got to say, look, okay, fine. If you don't like the way they present it, go ahead. And that's the thing. I mean, if you've got a dozen people writing dozen op-eds a year, I'm sure there's going to be some stuff in there that people could object to. But yeah, I'll take it up with them. I mean, it's not, but it's why are you whining about this? I mean, it's not really a substantive critique.
Right.
That. If all you're relying on is trying to interpret a few words in a popularization, you got to accept that you really don't have a grasp on what the what the deeper theory is.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. A brief diversion with Thomas Palley, which I did not put on the notes. He actually, okay, so he says, this is a paragraph from Thomas Palley's thing. As regards to, he basically just says that MMT, he says MMT's printing press economics has provided a simple counter to neoliberalism's claim that government has no financial space because it is akin to a private household. So he actually then has a footnote, and he says his version of why the household analogy is false. And his 3 reasons are: number 1, government can raise taxes to pay its bills while households cannot. Number 2, governments can issue money to pay its bills. And number 3, governments live forever where households don't. It's kind of just like he was like, I kind of agree with MMT. And then he goes into his explanation of it, which is just like very odd way of thinking of the household analogy.
Yeah, I mean, and be honest, it doesn't really it doesn't help that much because I mean, he's just basically writing out what the neoclassicals think. So
it's basically just a gigantic household.
Yeah, it's a gigantic household, less, but it's still I mean, technically it still has a financial constraint, and he's just written out the constraints. Well, yeah, but the government isn't exactly like a household, but the point of the neoclassics is that it faces a financial constraint,
right?
And he's actually agreeing with them, just saying, but yeah, it's not exactly. Well, who cares? I mean,
he's changing it. He's changing it so he doesn't have to change it. That's basically what he's doing.
Because no one believes that it's exactly the same. Like no one's stupid enough to say the government is exactly like a household. They know about that stuff, but it's still. I mean, they call it. It's the analogy is referring to because they introduce at the beginning. Here's your household financial constraint. Oh yeah, by the way, the government has its own financial constraint. That's almost the same thing. Mathematically, they're very similar.
Okay, so another one with it's going to take me just a minute to describe it. In your book, you say section 5.2, non-answerable critiques, just don't like the politics. And this is how I would phrase this is MMT is wrong because if it were right, then it would be bad. So since it would be bad, it has to be wrong. So like if MMT were right, it would put money creation in control of our corrupt, so-called elected leaders, the fiscal policy. And since government is hopelessly incompetent and corrupt, we can't allow that to happen. Therefore, MMT has to be wrong. And again, and kind of an extension, if MMT were right, then it would put, quote, the unwashed masses more in control of money creation. And that would cause unspeakable horror to the pocketbooks of the rich. Therefore, MMT must be wrong. What is left unspoken, in my view, is that the masses are unwashed because they're deliberately kept unwashed. And the government is hopelessly incompetent and corrupt because it's deliberately kept hopelessly incompetent and corrupt. And 3 simple examples are, Fed board members, we're trying to elect or appoint some Federal Reserve Board members, and there's some, those who care about all people are basically, they're coming up with horrible things to get them ejected before they can have any chance of getting close to it. Trump appointed department heads that deliberately wanted to destroy those departments, DeVos, several examples, Energy Department. And then Biden, he appointed department heads who don't necessarily want to obliterate those departments in the short term, but basically have committed to not let their powers loose. The Treasury Secretary won't mint a coin. The education secretary won't cancel student debt, and in fact is doing. There's something in the news just a few days ago that someone got $100,000 forgiveness from the courts, and the education secretary is stepping in to try and stop it. So it's just like, MMT is wrong because if it were right, it would be bad, but it's deliberately made that way. So.
Yeah. I mean, usually the way they would phrase it, they'll just say they don't care. It's not a question of right or wrong. They just don't like it. Like, it just say, well, they will just say it's just. I mean, the phrasing will be, it's, let's say they're a hard money person. It's just another funny money scheme. Like, I've seen that variants of that phrasing a few million times over the years. So that would be sort of the very typical phrasing. So they're not even discussing the theory. They're just saying, oh, it's just another funny money scheme where the government prints money and blah, blah, blah. So they don't even want to debate the theory. They're just saying, well, who cares? Because it's bad, as you say. They're worried about the sanctity of the currency, the dollar, and and there's sort of more sophisticated ones, like you just have the Austrian, like what you see on the internet is every fiat currency has failed and blah blah blah. So like, and
it's like every person who's ever lived has died.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Everyone, yeah, I mean that's it. Basically, because the currency is tied to a country. Every currency, like every country that is in existence, has failed. Well, yeah, no kidding. That's just a definition. But so you have sort of the straight, simplistic political view. Then you do have the slightly, the scientific neoclassical view, where they prove that fiscal policymakers have an incentive to run inflationary policy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of the I guess you could have I think I put that under like almost a good faith. They're at least sort of saying they're not really disputing the premises that government of MMT. It's just more the consequence. They're just saying, look, if you unleash fiscal policy, if you say there's no constraints, no financial constraints, governments have a bias towards inflationary policy, and that was sort of the big thing. That's sort of for the mainstream. That was sort of their big shtick, that there's a bias towards inflation, so you need an independent central bank to keep it under control. But that's the thing. That's something that at least that you can debate in a sense. But that's the thing, is that turns into a real debate. But for the ones I'd say were more bad faith, it's just like it's just another lefty scheme, and they just won't discuss it. And so that's because that's a bad faith, because they're not taking the idea seriously at all. Like they're, because technically, no, it's not necessarily any lefty. It's a theory about the economy, and so it could be run. So you sort of, on that question, you can go from a bad faith to there are things that you could have actual debates about. So people are on a spectrum.
Can you address the unwashed masses part of it? Because that's a big deal.
The unwashed mass, yeah, that's yeah. I mean, for usually the modern right wingers try to be pseudo populists. So I don't know if they use that phrasing anymore, but they'll go after the politicians. I'll say the politicians I'll do it. So they'll say it's the politicians' fault, and but that's the thing. I mean, the subtext is, they're giving the unwashed masses what they want, but I don't know. I mean, maybe I don't pay that much attention, but usually conservatives try to at least pretend. They try to pretend to be populist, so they'll usually phrase it as the politicians are doing it because they're being pushed by the masses. But their ires with the politicians, and so it doesn't. They just to a certain extent they don't care what the people think, because they shouldn't have influence. No matter what the people think, the government shouldn't be doing anything to help them, and so it solves the problem from their perspective.
Okay. All right. So it's two more things, but they're a little bit more involved than the rest of them. I don't know why, but it just kind of got me, you know, I just was really thinking about these things. So the next one is uh, MMT is, well, a derivation of the one we just talked about, which is MMT is wrong because if it were right, it would be bad, which your way of phrasing it is just don't like the politics.
Yeah.
A derivation of that, as I see it, is killing the messenger because you don't like the message. It's like, blaming the newspaper for the murder because they're reporting on the murder, as opposed to, being upset about the murder itself or doing something about the murder itself. And I see this related to the unwashed masses thing because if you kill the messenger, then you're controlling the message, and that prevents the unwashed masses from even getting the idea that something might be bad or that better is possible, because it's like then they might think of dissent. So you don't want dissent, because if there is dissent, then that takes a lot more energy to stop. So you outlaw the mere thought of dissent, which is the central theme of a 1932 science fiction book. I can't recall the title of it, but of basically, making thoughts unthinkable, which is a way of, if someone even thinks about dissent, then they get severe consequences, which, makes actual dissent much less likely. So those in power don't necessarily care about the information. They don't care about MMT, the theory itself. What they care about is that if the public understands MMT and then the consequences of that, of activating it, of becoming convinced by MMT, and then using it as a map to effectively demand better. Because actually, I say effectively because I just spoke with Fadl Kaboub a couple of months ago, and we were talking about the 2011 Tunisian revolution. There was a revolution, an out and out revolution, and barely anything changed because, in my view, they didn't know what to ask for, and they didn't ask for it effectively, and there were some superficial changes, but not much changed. So basically, uneducated people are easier to control. And this brings up kind of slavery, keeping slaves ignorant, of not allowing them to have books and so on, because even if they uprise, they'll do it in such an unorganized, uneducated fashion. It'll be much easier to stop that. So that was a bunch of stuff, but I'll stop there.
Yeah. Like, I mean, it's, I don't. I mean, in the bigger picture, there is just the way partisan politics has evolved, and I guess certainly the for the what the conservatives want. They have an objective. They want a small government, and so yeah, they don't want anything that would indicate, yeah, the government can do useful stuff. They want to shrink it so they can drown in a bathtub. Is I don't know whoever that was. It one of the various American free marketeers put it. So it's that's their overriding objective, and they're going to interpret MMT basically is that because look, if government is effective, well, that's no good. And it doesn't really matter whether it's technocrats or the masses. Anything that indicates the government can do something useful for society, they want to shrink it. They want to shrink the welfare state. For whatever reason, you can argue that the reason is straightforward. If you have workers with less bargaining power, it's much better for capitalists. So ultimately, for those people, hey, that's great. But how do you get a mass vote out of that? Because there aren't that many capitalists. So generally speaking, what they do, it's cultural politics. So they're
It's called what? What did you?
Cultural politics.
Cultural.
Yeah, whatever. All the basic most of the things you see, like right now, there's riots over in Canada, even over mask mandates and things like that, which Uh, there might be some people with definite concerns, but it's basically it's a movement. We've had a blockade organized by far right extremists, and they've got useful idiots to tag along with, and economics to just say, free market good, and that's the end of it. Free market good, government bad, and they don't want anything that interferes with that narrative. So yeah, I mean, definitely they don't want people thinking about politics or economics too closely, because the average person say, well, exactly how are these policies benefiting me, and not owners, and not the rich people. And it's a pretty uncomfortable conversation. So they want to change it to anything else. But that's going to be true whether it's MMT, post Keynesian. It's very much they want to basically have a narrative: government bad, needs to be shrunk. And you can argue, okay, fine. I mean, how much government interference do you want in the economy? Like, that's a debate. Like, it's a legitimate debate, but their preference is to change the subject as much as possible, and just leave as, oh, this is self-evident that free markets are better, and they don't want to start talking about the detail. Well, what if the government does X?
Okay. Okay. All right. So my last one, and this actually I have a little story related to this. That is, in your book, you have another one of these items is critics get to define what MMT is, and how I phrase this as, you don't define you, I define you. And, we're talking about how straw men, basically, they create straw men. But I think it's such that the MMT economists, the academics, are seen as simply second-class citizens, as animals, as whatever, as not worthy of talking with, and therefore their work is not worthy of reading. And so from their point of view, it's not a straw man, because they genuinely do get to define it. So they basically, they can basically change it to whatever they want. And this actually brings up, it really struck me how I just read a book about Emmet Till, the 14-year-old boy in 1950s who lived in Arizona, or who lived in Chicago, and he traveled to Mississippi, and he didn't realize the atmosphere and the attitude in Mississippi, and he basically acted like an equal. How dare him? He unknowingly acted like an equal, and that said some silly joke to a woman or whatever, who embellished it and got three grown men to torture and kill this 14-year-old boy and drown him in the lake. And it caused a trial that the three men got off from the legal system, let them off. But it was a significant milestone in whatever. And so there's a scene in that book that actually really struck me, that kind of accompanied my reading your book, with this concept of you don't define you, I define you. And I'm going to just describe that scene. So it's a historical fiction novel from the point of view of a 16-year-old white boy named Hiram. And so he's from Arizona, so he's a northerner as well, but his grandfather is from Mississippi. So he meets 14-year-old Emmet in Mississippi when visiting his grandfather. And when he was 9 years old, 7 years previous, he visited his grandfather and was walking in the fields, and he had sharecroppers. And he spoke to one of these Hiram, the little boy, spoke to one of these sharecroppers. And, it was just a pleasant conversation. And then they reached the end of a row, and briefly the sharecropper set his hoe, the tool, down to stretch before starting the next row. The boy picked it up. The grandfather happened to see this and then said, "How dare you basically, use my son to try and do your job, and, if it catch you do, I'm not paying you to be lazy or whatever. And if you do that again, I'm going to make you miss lunch and work your breaks and whatever. And then right after he talks to Hiram, his grandson, and he says, God made Negroes to work the land. They don't feel the heat like we do. They can work all day in the most hellish weather. They're strong people, good with their hands. You can do that too, but you were meant for more than that, more than just working the fields. You were meant to be boss. So it's, you don't define you, I define you. So in one sense, he's clearly, it's clearly shown that he does feel the heat. He doesn't want to work through breaks. But then on the other hand, the grandfather is defining that person, which is his way of justifying, basically blaming the exploiters for their own exploitation, blaming, Black people for the horrific treatment that they received, because that's how God made them, basically. So, that is related to these straw men in their eyes are not straw men, because these MMT academics and their works, which are not in the highly ranked journals, because they rank the journals, are worthy of not looking at. And so the straw men are not straw men. So I'll just leave it there.
Yeah. Actually, well, I guess with regards to the anecdotes, one thing growing up in Canada, back in the day, the only news you'd get from the States would have been from network news, and everything was sanitized. So to a certain extent, growing up, you say, oh, okay, all this, race relations issues were sorted. But yeah, I guess the propaganda things, more you learn about, oh, okay, maybe not really, but I actually just watched like the documentary, or rewatched documentary of Robert Johnson, the blues guitarist, and
Okay.
yeah, it's sort of, yeah, he didn't really, wasn't really discussed, but I mean, Canada has its own problems, but a bit less organized. I mean, the different sets of problems, but yeah, I guess, I mean, there's sort of, you could argue, like, just on one extent, the people using straw men, I mean, using a straw man is a pretty standard way of being lazy. So, it could just be intellectual laziness.
Dog whistle.
Be one, yeah, that yeah, it'll be some people will do it. I mean, but basically, that's all they've got. So,
Sure.
they're grasping at straw, so they'll do it. The other issue is, historically, I mean, I'm not that much of an expert on Marxism, but certainly, I believe it would be safe to say that a lot of the there was a lot of misrepresentation of what some of the Keynesians said. I think it was, Tardish. Oh, he was a Canadian. Like, he had a textbook that was competing with Samuelson, and they, basically got misrepresented, and that was it. There was a deliberate strategy of misrepresenting economists to go after them, in the Red Scare days, which was enough. Oh, they're communists, and so to a certain extent, they just, they did rely on, you misrepresent, rather than discussing, just basically, yeah, dog whistle, just say, oh no, they're unsound, and that would be it. It'd be another way to do it. I mean, to what extent it's a lack of respect of the people? It's going to depend. It's hard to say, because you have to remember, though, there's a lot of straw man attacks on MMT. So
you think?
like, most of them are like that. I mean, if you look at it, like, in terms of a volume, I mean, there are good critiques out there, but they're very hard to find. Like, just, if I see something, like I say, if I see something, someone's written something about MMT, 99.9% chance it's not good, and a lot of it will be a straw man is a standard thing. So I don't know. I mean, it's hard to. I mean, there's so many of them. It's not clear what their motivations are. So it's I can't go too far about why they're doing it, but it's an exceedingly common tactic, and in some cases, I think there was a deliberate strategy of misrepresentation by certain prominent people, economists. So, and then they just said, okay, it'll just get repeated. and then that was it. You like Krugman, he says MMT says X. Well, it's just going to get uncritically picked up, and fine. I mean, that's the thing. So if all someone knows is Krugman, well, okay, it sounds stupid because all they know about it is what Krugman says it says, and it sort of turns a little bit into this. He's misrepresented it, and when people objected to that, said, "Oh, well, but you said, he basically his thing about Calvin Ball is that he made up something, like he made up a misinterpretation." When people object to that, "Oh, well, you're objecting to me and misinterpreting. Oh, this is Calvin Ball." So it's related to that one that. But it's a bit hard to say, but certainly it is an attempt to minimize, the theory, marginalize the people, just attempt to make it look ridiculous by just making up very
By
stupid
being
stuff.
ridiculous.
Yeah, make them look ridiculous. So, yeah, it's to certain. If you go back the way, like, some of the early Keynesians were it's a playbook. It's a playbook that's been used in the past. It's this sort of thing. You just misrepresent it, and the thing is people aren't going to dig. So that's sort of the end of it, and that was certainly the strategy that was being employed. Is that to what extent they heard about it, they misrepresented and hope it all went away. And it was basically Stephanie Kelton's book. I mean, there was AOC, she brought it up, and then there was Kelton, which I believe was before Stephanie Kelton's book came out, and it became impossible to ignore. And that's when all the other articles came out. But the thing is that after a while, just making up stuff, which was the initial strategy, looked stupid because then people like me could just rip it to shreds, and people would see that. And I'm not exactly highly prominent, but would get passed along, say, well, wait a second. I mean, they're talking about stuff that's obviously nonsensical, so they had to up their game at least a little bit. And so some of the critiques they're actually, at least relying on out of context quotes and things like that. But they've sort of stepped, they've been forced basically because of those events to at least begin to address. But certainly in the early day, this is not true of all MMT. Like, obviously, like the post-Keynesians, this wouldn't be necessarily true. Like, they had debates in journals, so they were arguing with the MMTers whether they're misrepresented or not. But that would sort of depend. But if you look at the mainstream, the tactic was to ignore it for as long as possible.
Sure. And it's many of these papers, even the good faith ones, the debate is really not in the papers themselves; it's in the assumptions underneath it.
Yeah.
So it's like for example, I interviewed Dirk and Oscar in because of they wrote a response to what I think is a good faith critique, which is in my post. But their response was really not addressing the paper directly, which frustrated the author of that paper because it's questioning the assumptions themselves. So it's outside of that paper because the assumptions are just not questioned, and we're coming in and we're undermining what the paper is based on. I think that's pretty much all the tactic stuff. If we're pretty much at 11. So if there is, we've been pretty kind of negative focused. So if there's anything you feel like, kind of round this out or I don't know, maybe put a little bit more of a positive spin on part of this issue, please do.
Well, I mean, on the positive side, I mean, the point is that you are seeing at least some actual good faith debates. But I think, though, it has to be rephrased. You can't really just say, debate MMT. It's too big a topic. I don't think it makes any sense. You can't really, at this point, say, is MMT right or wrong? I think it's too large. You really have to say to yourself, well, what are we actually talking about? Is it what part of MMT? And then you could discuss that. And then it becomes very narrow, and it gets basically boring and academic. I mean, for me, okay, I can find that interesting, but for most people, it's not really that exciting. Like, let's say the external constraint, and you're arguing about, okay, what's the effect of exchange rate on the economy, blah blah blah. I mean, that's because the actual answer discussion is going to be, there's a lot of nuance, a lot of, well, maybe this, maybe that, and it's going to be a lot less exciting than some of these topics. But that's really going to be, I think you have to sort of discuss policies and the thing, rather than, I mean, you can't really just say wave a magic wand, solve the problem. You still have to say, well, what are the policies we're going to enact? What is it we want to do? And then you have to discuss those policies. Take, for example, let's say a Green New Deal. What exactly is involved? I mean, like, the MMT side, okay, a lot of it will be sort of financing. Okay, you can use workers from a job guarantee, but a lot of it still is going to be, well, what exactly are you doing? And that's sort of the debate. Like, what is the optimal? How do you provide power? How do you reduce energy consumption? That's challenging a little, but really, and then it's actually not really. The more you go, the less has to do with economic theory. It's more, well, it's maybe practical economics, like what are the effects? What do you think is going to happen? In a lot of cases, well, the answer is we don't know, and you just have to do your best. So it's, if things are healthy, it would just be a question of, there's going to be a debate about economics topics with MMTers and other people on different sides of the issue, and you can have, it'll probably be more an ideological split, but where people are, but it's not just going to be straight. Like, it was a little bit more obvious in the last cycle. In the last cycle, because of the austerity policies, it was very much, here's MMT view, there was a gulf between them, and it was tied into, well, is it a good idea to have austerity policies? To a certain extent, MMT won that debate, and there isn't that much serious discussion of austerity policies. So it's coming down to other things like, well, how do we actually deal with this virus, and blah blah blah, what about trade policy, and so, I mean, it's healthier, maybe less exciting, like from the point of view MMT is going to be less in the news, because in most cases it's not really just a question of financing. How do we finance this, or whatever that's not really the argument. It's like, what should we be financing, and those questions still need to be dealt with. But that's the thing, is that's sort of like, what concrete changes do we want to make for a better society? And it's a healthier place to be, because you have to accept the fact that, hey, MMT won the debate about austerity. No one's really pushing the idea anymore, other than I mean, there are some sound money bugs, but things have moved on. I mean, in macro, the big debate is, okay, how do you contain inflation? And right now, everyone is convinced that raising rates will do it. And it's just a question of, well, if we do 50 instead of 25, so that's sort of it. So that's really what everyone's focused on. Like, if you want to get some excitement now, you gotta be talking about inflation. I mean, at least like market economy. I mainly sort of follow sort of market related economics, which does get into politics, but it's not policy for the sake of policy. But that would be it. And the thing is that people really want a quick solution, and the quick solution is, hey, we're going to hike rates and the inflation problem will go away, and that's what everyone thinks is going to happen. So it's just a question of how fast. So there's not that much of an interesting debate, because that gets picked up on because everyone thinks they know the answer, and it might be the wrong answer, but they don't. Well, the thing is if inflation falls anyways, and if they raise rates and inflation falls, they'll just claim victory. So that's realistically the most likely outcome, I think. So it's pretty hard to it's a tough debate to get into right now.
Mm-hmm. I actually just coincidentally read a really good paper by John Harvey that I thought he wrote just a few months ago, but it was actually from last year, where he says inflation there's always winners and losers. There's never just losers. But you said before that, you basically alluded, they don't want the policies. I mean, they don't want the policies, or maybe you didn't say this. This is they don't want some of these policies. They just don't want them, but they don't want to admit that. And so therefore it's like kind of analogous to, the debate is not in the papers, it's in the assumptions underneath the papers, which frustrates the people. So in the same sense, they don't want the policies, but they don't want to admit that. So they have to revert to undermining the theory that underlies them.
Certainly. I mean, the assumptions. But anything involving the classical is a debate involving the assumptions, because to a certain extent, what defines the mainstream is they accept certain assumptions, and the heterodox people don't. And there is a division, a right-left divide within mainstream economics. They don't agree necessarily on policies, but they all agree on the assumptions. And so the sin in their eyes of heterodox is that they're questioning assumptions. And they don't want to. They don't want to. They're happy to debate policies, but they don't want to discuss the assumptions.
As long as you don't question the questions and you don't question the assumptions, then you can say whatever you like.
Yeah, it's and that's the thing. But you have to sort of play by their rules, and to a certain extent, it's interesting, like from my point of view. But the problem is for that. Does it really matter? Like the policy results matter, and let's say the assumptions are wrong. Well, so what? And that's, you need to answer that so what question. And part of the thing, there was a huge wave of heterodox papers after the paper books, after the financial crisis, going, neoclassical economics all wrong. I mean, I was part of that wave, but the tail end of it. But the thing is that it only goes so far. Well, they didn't predict the financial crisis. Well, yeah, great, but that's like a decade old. I mean, who cares? I mean, at some point you got to say, what are the issues that matter right now? And
it's like we're still talking about the 2016 election.
Everything sort of really should be policy based, and that's it. I mean, sort of the narrow focusing, really worked on the austerity policy, the euro, the construction of the euro. But right now, what everyone's concerned about is inflation. So it's a different environment. So it's going to be a different set of issues. Things will change. Maybe it'll get back to fiscal policy, be exciting again. But right now, everyone's freaking out about inflation.
All right. Well, Brian, thank you for doing this. This turned out to be very rather unusual, kind of among the topics that I talk about. This kind of just standard bullying tactics is kind of really what it was. So thank you for being flexible with that. I appreciate that.
It's something, I guess, I mean, I don't think about it, but certainly you see it. I mean, I mean, my point of view is I don't really want to worry. I don't want to worry about the motivations. It's not my concern, but I certainly have to zone out. I mean, I've found that it just annoys me. I mean, there's a few good papers, but they're terrible. Like what I see, cause like I said, I'm mainly on Twitter for social media, and I get news off there. Follow it for links, or but that's the thing, is that as soon as MMT comes up, it's just usually painful, and the criticism. So it's realistically, it's got to sort of focus on policy and constructive things. I think that's really it, because otherwise it's a little bit of a dead end at this point. Like in terms of certainly in discussing with non-MMTers, I think the focus really has to be on policy.
I agree, and I see this as, no, I don't want to dwell on this stuff, but now I think I have a grasp on kind of the general tactics and what to expect, and it allows me to be able to kind of recognize it and let it go quicker from this point forward. So, so thank you. Thanks for doing this. I appreciate it. I enjoyed your book.
Okay, thanks.
So thanks for that, and I'll see you back on Twitter.
Sure. Okay.
Music for this show is by RecTech. You can find RecTech on SoundCloud and Spotify at WRECK_TECH. To record Activist MMT, I use the iOS phone app Tape-A-Call Plus for recording phone calls and Zencaster for internet-based recordings. My post-production workflow starts by editing on the iOS app AnyTune Pro Plus, then transferring those timestamps to my Windows desktop. At that point, I crudely process the audio in Audacity and then implement the edits and do all of the final processing in the Reaper digital audio workstation. Activist MMT is hosted by Libsyn, and the video teasers are created with the online Headliner app.